afternoon. Welcome to today's session, Cybersecurity Drills. Check your security controls before attackers do. In today's session, we are going to take a look at what are cyber drills and how they can be leveraged to our advantage. However, before jumping into cyber drills, I would like to take a step back and take a look at why are cyber drills needed, if they are needed at all. On that note, let's begin our session for today. In recent times, we have seen an exponential increase in cyber attacks. When I say cyber attacks, we are encompassing network-based attacks and web application attacks. These attacks tend to target organizations from all sectors, ranging from government to finance, from healthcare to IT. As everyone must already be aware, these attacks can result not only in loss of data, but also loss of finances and, most importantly, loss of reputation. But we don't really need to worry about these, right? We already know that these attacks happen and we have taken necessary precautions in order to ensure that such attacks don't affect us. An attacker who would want to attack us will have to go through multiple lines of defenses, namely network firewalls, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, web application firewalls, antiviruses, basically all devices out there which help me in securing my network. So I can say that I'm pretty sure that I will not be attacked, right? Maybe not. So does this really ensure security is the question that we need to ask ourselves. Are we really as secure as we perceive ourselves to be? Or is it just an illusion of security? Let's take a look at a couple of recent security incidents which might help us analyze ourselves better. I'll take a couple of big names which have had a few security breaches in the recent past. The first one being Target. Target is a multinational firm second only to Walmart in the retailing business. However, last year, Target had a breach which was touted as the biggest ever in history, and Target is still struggling to salvage its reputation. Similarly, we have Adobe and Standard Chartered, two more big name organizations having global presence, but they suffered breaches pretty recently. In fact, Adobe had a breach where credentials of 38 million users were supposed to have been compromised. Similarly, Standard Chartered had a breach where account statements of the biggest customers were being compromised. Now, why did these breaches occur? Do these organizations not deploy the security devices which we listed a couple of minutes ago? They do. In fact, most of these organizations do not spare any expense in their security and buy top-of-the-line security products so that their networks are secure. Then why do these products fail? Are they not as secure as they claim to be? Or is there something that we are doing wrong? So let's try and take a look at why these events occur, or rather why our security devices fail. Now, I would like to list this out in two issues. The first one being operational. The first deals with lack of customization. Basically, the devices have not been tuned for the organization's custom needs and use the default set of rules. These rules are usually not sufficient to protect a network. The second issue being incorrect implementation. Now this could vary from not enabling blocking for a certain rule to rules not being entered in the correct sequence in a firewall. Also, incorrect placement of security devices can be an issue. Although these security devices are supposed to detect attacks, their potential cannot be leveraged without the correct placement in the network. The other set of reasons are what I like to label as post-implementation challenges. The first and the most common of these challenges is having too many rules. This is a challenge which is very common in any big organization with a huge network. There are so many rules that we don't really know which rule does what anymore. This can obviously lead to problems. On the other hand, we may end up with too few rules, which are very generic in nature and encompass my entire network, but they tend to leave loopholes which can be bypassed. The next challenge is confirming whether the rules which I have implemented really work or not. So for example, I have written a rule which is supposed to alert me whenever I have an XML injection attempt on my website. However, I am not really sure if the rule that I have written is correct or not. If I never see an alert for XML injection on my application, what does it mean? Does it mean that there was no attempt on my application, or does it mean that my rule is incorrect? We never know. Similarly, another challenge is understanding what the alert itself means. There are a lot of default rules which are shipped with the devices. However, we do not always understand what the alert is for. If you get an alert titled TCP segment rewrite, you may or may not be able to make out what the alert means. Having a skill set is very necessary in understanding what the rules or the signatures are doing for your network. Similarly, we have false positives posing a major challenge in any organization. End of the day, any rule or signature works on the principle of pattern matching, which can result in a lot of false positives. False positives are nothing but alerts which really are not attacks. These false positives obscure an actual attack from an analyst view. For example, we are looking for the SQL keyword count, but count also ends up alerting us for country or other keywords which have the word count in them, like counting. These keywords tend to increase the false positive rates in my alerts. On the same note, a generic rule like this can also end up creating a lot of alerts which create noise. Noise here is nothing but non-relevant alerts. To quickly solve this issue, an admin might simply disable the rule, but this will end up in missing out valid events too. Now, there are certain areas which get ignored. For example, there are devices to monitor my internal threads, my internal users, my external threads, malwares, but I have a small leased line connecting me to a third-party vendor whom I outsource my printing jobs to. Who is monitoring that? Maybe no one. This acts as a blind spot in my security. Last but not the least, we have the case of rules which were added for a purpose but were not removed once their purpose was served. Such rules may later be exploited by attackers. Now, before we start panicking looking at these daunting list of challenges, let me assure you that all the above factors can be addressed. Root cause. So, for issues that stem out of flaws like incorrect placement of a device or not comprehensively covering all possible attack surfaces, we can mitigate the issue using a secure network architecture review. Analyzing the architecture helps us in analyzing blind spots, helps us in analyzing whether the security devices or the sensors have been placed in their correct locations or not. Similarly, most issues that stem from incorrect rules or insufficient rules can be mitigated with a rule-based analysis. A rule-based analysis would let us know if any rule is placed out of order or there is a rule which should not be present in my network. But what about other issues? For example, rules which we are not sure about or rules which have never been tested. This is where a cyber drill can help us. So what exactly is a cyber drill? I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with what a fire drill is. Simply put, a cyber drill is its equivalent in the digital world. Just like a fire drill helps us in testing the fire alarms and the evacuation procedures by simulating a possible fire scenario, a cyber drill is supposed to help us test the defensive measures we have put up in order to protect our network and our response mechanism in case of an incident. A cyber drill consists of conducting a series of unplanned attacks on a test environment in our network, which will help in determining our security posture. Now, A cyber drill might sound very similar to a penetration test or a pen test as we call it. So let us take a look at how similar or how different they are. A pen test, as we know, is used to identify vulnerabilities in our application or in our network. It gives us the security posture with respect to the various services running in our system. So a pen test may be able to help us in identifying that the FTP that we use is outdated and has a buffer overflow vulnerability in it. On the other hand, a cyber drill is useful in testing our defense systems and incident response. It is supposed to give us a broader view of the security posture, keeping in mind our entire infrastructure. So a cyber drill will tell us whether someone can get in through a possible attack surface or not, or even enumerate all possible attack surfaces out there for us. Pen test skills are useful in a cyber drill too, when we want to test the security controls using a cyber drill. So let's say that we perform a pen test of the entire network instead of a small segment. How different would it be from a cyber drill? Frankly speaking, such an activity would be very similar to a cyber drill in that it will help us in identifying the vulnerabilities in our network, which will in turn help us to understand the effectiveness of our security controls. However, what a pen test usually does not help us with is testing our incident response mechanisms. So how exactly will a cyber drill help us? What will it help us achieve? Very simply put, it helps us in testing our attack preparedness. We will be able to identify if there are any missing controls which need to be introduced, or if any control is not being utilized properly. For example, during the target breach, their internal IDS raised an alert, but the alert was missed. Maybe the alert was not paid attention to, maybe it got discarded. Maybe it was raised by a device which was not being monitored. We don't know. However, a cyber drill can help us in avoiding a similar scenario in our case. Also, we can test the effectiveness of the incident management procedures that we have laid out for our organization. Our teams also get a taste of how real-world scenarios can be. It can give valuable feedback for the incident management plan. For example, during an attack simulation, we realize that we need to block a certain IP address. How long does it take to enforce this rule? Is there any reboot or downtime required? Is the team equipped to push these rules quickly and efficiently? Are there any other places in the infrastructure which get affected because of this rule? These are some of the questions that a cyber drill can help us in getting the answers for. Feedback from the cyber drill can be used to further strengthen our existing defense systems. Last October, dozens of Wall Street firms participated in a cyber defense exercise named Quantum Dawn 2. The objective of this drill was to measure how well the financial sector is able to deal with cyber threats. Governing authorities conducting a similar set of cyber drills for at least organizations in the banking and financial sector. In India, CERT carries out an annual drill for all the banks in the public sector, with the private sector being free to participate. I hope these reasons adequately highlight the advantages of conducting a cyber drill for the organization. The next question is, how do we go about conducting a cyber drill? Now, when we want to conduct a cyber drill, there are multiple approaches which we can choose from. However, we need to choose one which best suits our needs. For example, I can choose between conducting a drill in-house or with the help of a third party. Similarly, we may want the drill to be a blind exercise, or we may want to inform our teams beforehand. A blind drill means a drill where we do not inform the monitoring team and test their preparedness to deal with incoming attacks. However, how do we decide which approach is to be taken? The factors that we need to consider when deciding on the approach to a cyber drill are: first, the objective. What do I want to achieve with the help of my cyber drill? Am I trying to test my security controls, or am I trying to test my incident response preparedness, or am I trying to test both? It also depends on your current capabilities. Do you have the capability to carry out an attack on your network? Is the expertise available to you in-house? If yes, you can carry out an in-house approach. However, if you do not have the skill set needed to carry out a controlled set of tests on your network, then you may want to hire a third-party service. Last but not the least, you need to consider the experience that you have with these kind of drills. Are you a first-timer trying out this drill for the very first time? Then maybe you would want to choose an informed approach and have a third party involved. Are you a veteran with a lot of these drills under your belt? Do you have a mature network which has undergone a lot of testing already? Then you may want a blind approach in your case. Let's take a look at an example to figure out how we can decide which approach suits our needs. Okay. In the example shown, we have the objective of identifying missing controls in my environment. So let's assume that there is a network where we do not know what controls are missing, or rather the controls which have been placed are adequate or not. So the objective becomes identifying missing controls. However, this is my first time carrying out such a drill. Also, I do not have any in-house expertise in testing. That is, I do not know how to carry out attacks on a web application or on a network. Based on my objective, my current capability, and my experience, it turns out that hiring a third-party service to help me with the drill is more beneficial to me rather than trying to do things on my own. We can decide our approach based on similar factors, and once the approach has been decided, we now need to start planning for the drill. The drill activity itself can be divided into three broad phases. First, the details of the drill are finalized. Secondly, the actual execution of the drill. And finally, the outcome of the drill, which helps us in determining our security posture and take back learning regarding how we can improve our controls. So let's take a look at the first phase, that is planning. A cyber drill has to be well planned in order to draw the maximum benefit out of it. Some key factors to be kept in mind when planning a cyber drill are shown on the current screen. The first one involves setting up a test network. We need to set up a dummy network with some test servers and user machines protected by the same set of devices and the same set of rules as our real network. However, this network has to be what we call as a closed loop, so that any damage which is being done on my test network does not transfer to my actual network. Next is setting up my attack and defense teams. The attack team is the one which is entitled with the responsibility of carrying out the attacks on my test network. The defense team, on the other hand, is supposed to identify and block incoming attacks. For attacks which cannot be blocked, the defense team needs to have a response mechanism to quickly mitigate the effect of the attack. Next, we need to plan out the attacks on our network. This would be determined by the objective of the drill and the capability that we have. Planning out the list of attacks is important. These attacks should match the defensive capabilities of the organization. For example, planning out too many web-based attacks when you do not have a WAF deployed will not really lead to any useful results. Lastly, for attacks which cannot be blocked, a mechanism needs to be put in place in order to quickly respond to attacks. We need to plan an escalation tree, that is, whom should the attacks be reported to, and the necessary steps to be taken to contain an incident, and the response needed in order to do a recovery and get the resources back online. This phase is pretty important. in a real scenario, when an attack happens, people are really not sure about whom to inform. They might end up informing their immediate manager. They might not end up informing anyone in trying out a course of action on their own. Hence, an escalation tree is pretty important. Having an escalation tree helps people follow a dedicated approach. A cyber drill can help us in testing out the escalation tree and its effectiveness, also making changes wherever needed. Lastly, we need to plan for scenarios where the test network may be compromised by real attackers. This is particularly important if the test is being carried out over the internet. An attacker may try to exploit a vulnerability in the test network and then access the real network. This makes it all the more important that the test network is segregated from my actual network and has a quick shutdown feature in case of an incident. One of the most important things that we need to do before we start the drill is deciding the success criteria. That is, the parameters based on which we can decide the success or failure of the drill. These parameters differ from organization to organization and are decided based on the core objective of the drill. If you are a new organization doing this drill for the first time, the percentage of attacks detected or blocked successfully becomes the basic criteria for evaluation. However, for more mature environments, in addition to the percentage of attacks detected, the response speed and the accuracy of the attacks detected are also important. These parameters can be made more granular as required. Let's take a look at an example here. A new organization might be satisfied with a 90% detection rate, but a mature organization would have requirements of 95% detection, 90% blocking, and maybe 5 minutes of response time. So on an average, I can say that if I detect all the incoming attacks and am able to successfully block 90% of the attacks, I would say that my drill was successful and my security controls are adequate enough to protect me against most incoming attacks. On the other hand, if I was not able to detect most of the attacks coming in, or I miss out on a certain criteria of attack, like web-based attacks in this case, then I know where my loopholes in security lie and I can improve my security therewith. Basically, based on the objective of the drill and our current capabilities, we need to create a benchmark of parameters which can act as the success evaluation criteria. Now, once we are done with the planning phase, we can move on to the actual execution. Just like a fire drill, the planning and preparation phase of a cyber drill is the more difficult part. The drill itself is pretty simple if the plan is followed properly. So that's all that is there in the execution phase, that we need to follow the plan that we have so painstakingly made for the drill. Moving on, at the end of the drill, we need to gauge our performance in order to get an idea about our security posture. This has to be done based on parameters which were decided before the drill while setting up the success criteria. Also, we need to incorporate learning from the drill. We should come up with a plan of action for the weaknesses identified. Relevant changes should be made in the rules or signatures of the devices to compensate for attacks which were missed during the drill. Also, proper processes need to be defined and implemented to ensure a good response in case of an attack getting through. Some examples of learnings can be that if I miss out on all web application based attacks, it might be because although I have deployed an IPS IDS, I do not have a web application firewall in place. So it might be a good idea for me to procure a web application firewall for my crucial applications. Similarly, during the drill, we might notice that our response team was not able to get back a website which has been defaced by the attackers. This calls for an update on our incident response procedures. Maybe we need to have a better backup of our website. Maybe we need to have our people more trained in getting the website back up within a limited time frame. Similarly, during the attack, we might notice that even though there are a couple of rules present, attacks are getting through. This may be because the rules are either insufficient or incorrect. This calls for an update in the rules or signatures of my respective security devices. Based on all these learnings, we can strengthen our overall network and ensure that attackers are not able to get through. Now, once we are through with the drill, are we done? We are almost done. There are just a couple of more things which I would like to mention before we can call this a closure. The first and most important is removing the test beds. Sometimes, once the drill is done, we might forget to remove the test beds which we had put up in place. These test beds may contain known vulnerabilities which were used to exploit the test network. However, these can be used by attackers in the future if left unattended. Similarly, if we had made any changes to the rules or signatures of our security devices for the purpose of the drill, we need to ensure that we revert these changes back to what they were before the drill begins. Once we are done with these, the drill has been concluded successfully. This cyber drill can be used to learn the weaknesses in our defense system and strengthen the same. Repeating this activity regularly can help us in safeguarding ourselves better. So at the end of the cyber drill, based on the learnings we have, we can implement changes in our security controls and processes. Once these changes have been made, we can review them once again to ensure that they are correct architecturally as well as from a rule-based perspective, and maybe carry out a drill again to test whether these were implemented correctly or not. With this, I would like to conclude this webinar and thank you for the participation. In case you have any questions, we would be glad to take them. Thank you. One of the questions we have here is, should the test network replicate the original network? Not necessarily. My original network might be huge. It will contain a lot of devices, a lot of applications. What we need to replicate is the broad setup. So if I have a DMZ segment with a lot of servers, all I need to do is recreate a DMZ with maybe just one server and ensure that the controls that are put in place for the actual server are in place for the replicated server as well. The objective of the cyber drill is to test the controls and not really the systems that the controls are trying to protect. Hence, it is more important to replicate the controls rather than the actual network itself. I hope I have been able to answer your question. The next question is the difference between a pen test and a cyber drill. As we had discussed earlier, a pen test is more focused on finding vulnerabilities within a network, whereas a cyber drill is more generic in nature. They do have some similarities and there are some overlapping features in the sense that I can use a pen test to test my security controls. Basically, if I find a vulnerability and am able to exploit it successfully, it tells me that the controls in place are not really sufficient. However, a pen test will help me find issues like a buffer overflow or maybe a clear text protocol in use, whereas a cyber drill is actually used to just determine whether the controls in place are doing their job properly or not. We won't really have a control in place to stop clear text traffic from flowing. It's more of an implementation thing. What we would have is maybe a WAF in place to protect a buffer overflow or an IDS in place to detect whenever a buffer overflow is being done. I hope I've been able to make the differences clear. A pen test is more oriented towards testing, whereas a cyber drill is more oriented towards gauging the response controls. The third question is, are there any other tests which we can conduct as a part of the cyber drill? Okay. In addition to the pen test, what you can conduct is an incident response test. This would mean simulating an incident in your organization. An incident could be a malware outbreak, or it could also be a compromised machine somewhere in the network where an internal attacker is trying to steal data from the servers. Now, when I say we simulate a malware outbreak, we don't really need to use a malware. We just assume that a particular machine has been infected and is sending out malicious requests to devices within my network. And then we see how the incident team responds back for this particular scenario. The next question that we have is, what personnel skills are required for conducting these tests? Okay. In order to conduct these tests, rather than the skill set, let me brief you on the criteria which is necessary in order to conduct a successful cyber drill. First and foremost, we need to know our network. We need to know what we are trying to gauge, what we are trying to test. So we should be able to simulate our network. Then we need to have two teams for attack and defense. So the skill set for both these teams will be varied. The attack team needs to know how to exploit scenarios, how to bypass some controls, and how to extract data from a network. On the other hand, the defense team needs to know how to block incoming attacks, how to detect attacks which cannot be blocked, and in case an attack gets through successfully, how the response has to be made, what is the response time which is acceptable to the company, and in case there is a serious incident, how and when do we shut down the network or isolate the infected machine. These skill sets would primarily help you in conducting a successful drill. The next question is, are there any guideline sheets to perform a cyber drill or any case study? Okay. From what I understand, there are not any guidelines for the cyber drills so far, although there are a few papers which have been published by Stanford and a couple of other universities. There is no set guidelines defined insofar. As far as case studies are concerned, most cyber drills are performed for the organizations themselves, so they do not tend to release the outcome of the drills, but just use them for their internal betterment. So it would be very difficult to find the case study of a cyber drill. However, popular drills like the one that we mentioned, that is Quantum Dawn 2, also the CERT drills in India and other regions in the Asia Pacific, do declare the results of their tests and provide some details as to what they had done during the test. But I'm afraid you will not be able to find a comprehensive guideline anywhere. Okay. The next question is, if we are already getting a pen test conducted, what else should be done additionally as a completeness step for the cyber drill? Okay. If you're getting a pen test done, in this case I am assuming, frankly speaking, is not always possible. Whenever I, as a security professional, have been called upon for a penetration test of a network or an application, I would be either given a small segment within the actual network, or I would be given a couple of applications amongst the various applications in that network. So a pen test usually is an in silos incident which happens for small segments of the network. However, if you are doing a pen test for the entire network encompassing your user LAN segments, your DMZ, your server segments, and any other areas in your network, as well as your external facing entities, then the pen test serves as the attack surface of your cyber drill. In order to complete your cyber drill, you need to ensure that during the pen test, you have your monitoring team act as the defense team and provide you real-time alerts on the attacks which are being done by the pen tester, so that you can test whether your security controls really work or not. For attacks which get through, you can conclude that your security controls are either insufficient or are missing certain values, which can be taken back as a learning to improve your security controls. Okay. The next question is, if I'm not testing my actual devices in the network, how can I be 100% sure that I have a good architecture? Okay, that's a pretty good question. In here, there are two separate questions that I would like to answer. First is, how can I be 100% sure if I do not have the actual device replicated? Second is, how do I know whether my architecture is good enough or not? Now, as regards the architecture question, I would say that an architecture analysis or a secure architecture analysis is something that helps you in determining whether your devices, security devices as well as your regular devices, are placed in the correct segments or not. Are there appropriate rules between them or not? Are the devices needed in place or not? So I have a user LAN segment and a DMZ, but they are not separated by a firewall, but only connected by a switch. This is identified quickly in a network architecture analysis. For this, we don't really need to replicate the network. So we can be sure that you have a good architecture if you're getting your network architecture analysis done from a professional. The next question of how do we be sure that even if I have not replicated my network or my device, I am secure. Now in this case, I would again like to point out that a cyber drill is actually used to test the controls and not really the devices. A cyber drill will tell me whether the controls in place prevent me from getting attacked or getting compromised or not. So I would like to take an example here. Let us say that I have a server which is vulnerable to SQL injection, in the sense that I use queries which can be exploited in the backend. However, I have a web application firewall or a WAF in place which prevents SQL injection attempts from reaching my server. In this case, although my server in theory is still vulnerable to SQL injection, my WAF prevents these attacks from successfully getting through. In case of a cyber drill, I'll be testing whether my WAF works effectively or not, and not really testing whether my server is free of SQL injection or not. I hope that answers your question. The next question is, a cyber drill comes first, then a pen test, am I right? Okay. If you are talking about this as two separate events, then I would say that a pen test comes first and then a cyber drill. A cyber drill should ideally be used to test whether your controls are in place or not. A pen test is used to check what things are currently exploitable. So if you do a pen test first, you will find out vulnerabilities in your system, you will find out the loopholes. Once you have patched them up, once you are sure that your network works and is secure against attacks, you can use a cyber drill to verify whether your controls are actually working as they intend to or not. To take an analogy to the fire drill here, first we install the controls that are needed to actually alert us in case of a fire, and then we carry out the fire drill. So we would first set up the alarms, the sprinkler systems. We'll test whether the water actually comes to the sprinkler or not. This is very similar to carrying out the pen test. Once we have tested all of these segments, once we are sure that our fire alarm system works and our evacuation process are in place, only then we do a fire drill, not before that. So to answer your question, a pen test would ideally come first and then the cyber drill would follow. The next question is how a cyber drill can help in addressing zero-day attacks. A cyber drill may or may not help you in preventing zero-day attacks, because that is not the objective of a fire drill. A fire drill is ideally just testing your controls. However, that said, it can help you in preventing yourselves or safeguarding yourselves from zero-day attacks, in that if your security controls in general protect you against attacks, then you might still be protected against any zero-day attack out there which is within the scope of your security devices. To give you an example, let's say that I have a web application firewall in place which protects me from injection-based attacks by whitelisting only a couple of characters which I want to get through. Within the next 2 days, there is a zero-day attack, another variant of some injection-based attack, which makes use of a special character that has not been used before. If my security devices are using whitelisting and they are properly protecting all the right places in my application, I might still be protected against this kind of a zero-day attack. On the other hand, if I have a zero-day attack which exploits a bug in a specific place in an application or in a software, that would be really difficult to protect against with the help of the security devices we have in place. However, a cyber drill can help us in ensuring that we have the proper response mechanisms to detect and contain these kind of attacks. So maybe we might not be able to prevent the attack itself, but we may be able to respond to the zero-day attack better if we have a cyber drill in place. Okay, I guess that's all the questions that we have. In case you have any more questions for us, we are always reachable on our website, and you can also view this presentation later on online on Palladium. I'd like to thank you everyone for attending. Thank you and have a good day.